All right, I think we're going to get started. So I'm Josh Garoon. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And on behalf of my colleagues in the department who are scattered throughout the auditorium, I want to welcome you all to the 2015 Slesinger Lecture. It's my privilege today to introduce Dr. Seth Holmes, who's sitting right here, before he presents the lecture. Seth's an exceptionally busy professor, doctor, and social activist. So I'm very appreciative that he's agreed to join us here today, giving a talk titled Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, Migrant Farm Workers in the United States. Before I introduce Seth, though, I want to say a few words about the people who made the lecture possible this year, and then about Professor Doris Slesinger, in whose honor the lecture is named. As you'll see in your program, this is the 4th edition of the Slesinger Lecture, and I want to thank the faculty and staff in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology for all of their support in putting it on. And I'd like to give particular recognition to our chair, Jess Gilbert, who's sitting down here in the first row. Wave, Jess. And I also want to give special thanks to our administrators, Ken, Megan, Lee, and Carl, for all their hard work in making the lecture happen. I also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors for this year's lecture. They include the Departments of Anthropology and Family Medicine, the Global Health Institute, the Collaborative Center for Health Equity, the Human Rights Program, the Wisconsin Collective for Ethnographic Research, affectionately known as WISCR, and the Institute for Research on Poverty, which I don't think goes by ERP. We also thank the University Lectures Committee for their generous financial support. With that, on to Doris. Professor Doris Slesinger earned her PhD in sociology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1973. She joined the faculty of what was then known as the Department of Rural Sociology here at UW in 1974, and was promoted to full professor 10 years later. In 1987, the department chose Professor Slesinger to serve as its chair, a position no other woman had filled for a Department of Rural Sociology anywhere in the United States. Throughout her life, Professor Slesinger was a passionate advocate for migrant workers' rights and women's health issues. Her research and activities concern the health and well-being of minorities, including African Americans and Native Americans, women, migrant farm workers, and the rural poor. She retired in 1998 and remained engaged in university affairs until her passing in 2006. I'd like to share briefly what Professor Leanne Tigas, then chair of the department, said to Slesinger later that year, as her words are far more eloquent than anything I could hazard to say. She said, "Doris was in the generation of women professors who were always breaking new ground. Academic women in the generations that followed have had a somewhat easier time because of the pioneers like Doris who forged the way, fought the early battles, and established the precedents. Doris actively and continuously tried to make our way easier by her service as an advisor and mentor to women graduate students and junior faculty. I've witnessed the love and loyalty of women for Doris, and in the past months, their pain at losing her has been palpable. She was soft-spoken, but never unspoken. She was passionately concerned about fairness and justice, and she never forgot that people have many dimensions to their lives. Doris brought intelligence, honesty, and humor to all her activities and relationships. We will miss her, but we are so glad she was here for us." In 2007, the Department of Rural Sociology established the Doris P. Slesinger Fund, using the $10,000 bequest that Professor Slesinger left to the department. The Department of Community and Environmental Sociology, which is what the Department of Rural Sociology became, in collaboration with the Department of Family Medicine, subsequently decided to use the fund to support this lecture. The annual event supports and honors Professor Slesinger's legacy of research in health and social justice and stimulates campus-wide discussion of the principles of community engagement that are still enshrined in the Wisconsin idea. After hearing all of that about Doris, you can understand why Seth is such a perfect presenter of the 2015 Slesinger Lecture, if from nothing more than his talk today. That title shared, by the way, with his book. More about the book in a minute, but for now I want to point out that it's on sale out there. It will be available during the reception that's in the atrium. Free drink, free food, stick around. And Seth's happy to sign your copy once you acquire one. Seth's capsule biography is in the program that most of you should have. So this will just be a highlight reel. After receiving his PhD from the universities of California, Berkeley, and San Francisco, and his MD from UCSF, Seth moved to Penn for his medical internship and residency, and on to Columbia as a Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholar. He then took the position, which he currently holds, of Martin Sisters Endowed Chair Assistant Professor in the UC Berkeley School of Public Health and the Graduate Program in Medical Anthropology. He is the co-director of the MD-PhD track in Medical Anthropology, coordinated between UCSF and UC Berkeley, and the founding director of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. Seth's also an active physician. He sees patients in Oakland, California, and spent part of lunch today telling several graduate students about his work in palliative care. That's reflected in his research interest in death and dying, but that interest is one of only many that he has in the area of population health. He focuses on health disparities and the social determinants of health globally. As a medical anthropologist, that focus takes to the field in the forms of ethnography and social theory, as well as in social studies of medicine and science. Seth's work encompasses issues of race, social class, citizenship, gender, and sexuality. It includes immigration and migration, as well as gender theory, queer theory, and LGBTQ health. And he's particularly interested in the naturalization and normalization of social hierarchies and health disparities, and concomitant social suffering and symbolic violence. And if any of that sounds eloquent, it's mostly because Seth wrote it. He's published on most of these topics in the pages of Social Science and Medicine, Medical Anthropology, Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry, and other leading academic journals. Now, all of that probably seems as if it's enough to keep anyone busy. But Seth is most famous for being the author of Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, his 2013 book from the University of California Press. Now, the book is great reading, which can be attested by the range of undergraduates who are sitting in this room, who've read the book for Leanne's capstone course, and who've read parts of it or articles derived from it in my own public health course. It's a terrific, terrific book. It's also Claire Windland's anthropology graduate seminar fodder, so I think a lot of people in this room have probably read it. And in addition to all of that, the book has won a range of awards, including the New Millennium Book Award from the Society for Medical Anthropology, the Society for the Anthropology of Work Book Award, the Association of Humanist Sociology Book Award, and in November, the Margaret Mead Award from the American Anthropological Association and the Society for Applied Anthropology. And that last award counts among its recipients such anthropological luminaries as Paul Farmer, Nancy Shepard Hughes, and Philippe Bourgois. Bourgois and Shepard Hughes were Seth's mentors at Berkeley, and having read Seth's book, I think the comparisons it's drawn to the work of Paul Farmer are extremely apt. He's a rising star in what we could and should call public anthropology. We've already welcomed Seth with the closest approximation of California weather we can muster here in Wisconsin. Not a given in Madison in mid-March, and he's planned well in leaving tomorrow morning before we dive back down the thermometer. While we have him here then, I ask you to join me in giving Dr. Seth Holmes the warmest of University of Wisconsin welcomes.
Thank you for the generous introduction, Josh. It's an honor to be here speaking with the Community and Environmental Sociology Department, which I've gotten to know today through grad students and undergrads, all of whom are inspiring for the future of our universities and our world. Also to be here with a couple informal mentors, Walt Schalick and Claire Wendland from the MD PhD social science world, as well as the Department of Anthropology, the Global Health Institute, and the Department of Family Medicine. So it's especially an honor to be invited to speak the year after Jack Geiger in the Doris Slesinger lecture, someone who focused so strongly on health and social justice and on farm workers and published this, in the early 2000s, a review of the health of farm workers in Wisconsin. So I'm a physician. I see patients in a hospital in Oakland, California, a public hospital. And as a physician, I'm trained to give you a PowerPoint lecture, which when I'm in the audience, I find rather boring. As an anthropologist teaching at UC Berkeley, I'm trained to read you a paper, which when I'm in the audience, I find rather boring. So today, I'm going to do both. I'm speaking from the book that came out in 2013 that Josh mentioned, Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, Migrant Farm Workers in the United States, I'll be touching on pieces from a few different sections and some of my kind of new analysis of this material that I haven't published yet. Other aspects of the book I can't talk about, so I'm happy to answer questions or talk during the reception about other aspects. My dad heard me give a talk at the University of Oregon not too long ago and told me that I should warn you that there are a few slides that are blank, and it's not because there's a malfunction, it's because I planned those to be blank, either because I'm reading some statistics that it seems to me are especially important to pay attention to, or I'm trying to do something theoretical that I didn't want distracted by a photograph. So, there are two primary questions that animate my research and my scholarship. The first is, how do global social structures and social hierarchies produce suffering for certain categories of people? Actually, for all people. Specifically in this project, how are native Mexican migrants positioned by categories of race, class, and multi-layered citizenship throughout their transnational circuits, and how does this positioning produce health, illness, and suffering? My second question is, how do global social hierarchies and socially structured suffering come to be understood as normal and natural in society and in medicine? Specifically in this project, how do representations and schemata of perception in public culture, as well as in the clinic, serve to make invisible or legitimate the predicaments and illnesses of indigenous Mexican farm workers? I'll spend the first section of the talk setting the ethnographic scene, mapping social positions and spatiality on a farm, and then move into analyzing and theorizing these two problems. The National Agricultural Worker Survey indicates that 81% of farm employees are immigrants, 95% of whom are born in Mexico, and 52% of whom are undocumented. It's estimated that there are 1 million indigenous Mexicans from the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca in the United States, primarily Mixtec, Zapotec, and Triqui people. Transnational migration is particularly compelling here with the Doris Slesinger lecture, given all of her research on farm workers in Wisconsin, and given some of our visitors here from the state of Wisconsin Seasonal and Migrant Farm Labor Program. In terms of health, migrant farm workers have extremely poor outcomes. I need to see what my next slide is. Okay. To be specific, agricultural workers have an occupational fatality rate, in other words, a death rate from their work, roughly 5 times the national average for workers. Migrant and seasonal farm workers suffer increased rates of many conditions, including injuries, HIV, TB, heat stroke, malnutrition, insomnia, anxiety, sterility, and liver and kidney disease. But despite such poor health status, migrant farm workers have very poor access to health care. Only 5% have health insurance. And although there's a federally funded migrant health program that funds migrant clinics in various areas, that program estimates that it serves roughly 13% of its intended population. Despite the increased occupational injury rate, farm workers are excluded from workers' compensation benefits, including health care, in most states. And finally, there's research that shows that indigenous Mexican migrants have significantly lower rates of health insurance than their mestizo Mexican counterparts. This transnational ethnographic project involved a Follow the People multi-sited fieldwork, accompanying indigenous Triqui migrants from the Mexican state of Oaxaca. The fieldwork began in rural Washington state and involved 5 months living in a labor camp, picking strawberries and blueberries, accompanying farm workers anytime they were sick to a clinic or hospital, and interviewing farm owners, supervisors, area residents, migrant health physicians, and nurses. At the end of those 5 months, I accompanied several Triqui extended families in 7 green Aerostar minivans as they migrated and spent 3 months in the Central Valley of California, where we first lived homeless out of our cars, using a city park bathroom for roughly a week, until we could find someone who was willing to rent to people without a credit history. At that point, 19 of us moved into a 3-bedroom slum apartment that had 1 or 2 families in each bedroom, 1 family in the living room, and then I, as the gay physician anthropologist, had the closet, which was actually quite helpful because I could close the door and write field notes and not be woken up in the middle of the night. I was the only one with my own door. During this time, we pruned vineyards when we could find work. We spent a lot of time fixing Aerostar minivans because they break down and it was hard to find work. I accompanied Tricky people whenever they went to clinics and hospitals to give birth or when they were sick. And I interviewed the farm workers, farm contractors, physicians, and nurses. Next, I spent 4 months in the Tricky home village of San Miguel in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico, in a partially constructed concrete house that was being built as money from family members in Washington and California was being sent back. I helped with house construction, harvesting and planting corn, as much as help. I'm not sure they would say I was helpful. I accompanied Tricky children and elders as they took care of the oxen and goats, and I went to the local clinic and interviewed the physicians and nurses who worked there. In April of that year, I accompanied 10 young Tricky men as they ventured from San Miguel to a border town in Sonora, Mexico, made contact with a coyote, a border crossing guide, and crossed the border into Arizona, were apprehended by the Border Patrol. They were deported back to Mexico. I was kept in Border Patrol jail until I was released with a fine for not going through customs. And then I spent roughly a month there interviewing border activists, Border Patrol members, and civilian border vigilantes who would talk with me. I then returned to California and Washington again for one more season in each of those places. And then over the last 10 years since that 18 months of field work, I've gone back and visited at least 2 of the field sites each year. So the rest of the talk today will take place in the Skagit Valley of Washington State, roughly halfway between Seattle, Washington, and Vancouver, BC. The Tanaka Farm's the largest farm in the Skagit Valley, employing 500 people in the peak of picking season, June through October. The farm advertises itself as, quote, a family business spanning 4 generations with over 85 years experience in the small fruit industry. On a practical level, employees on the farm grow, harvest, process, and sell berries to support the of this farm. On another level, the structure of farm work adheres a subtle and complex hierarchy. The structure of labor is both determined by the asymmetries in society at large, specifically those organized around race, citizenship, class, and gender, and it reinforces those larger inequalities. The structure of farm labor includes several hundred workers occupying many positions from owner to receptionist, field manager to tractor driver, berry checker to berry picker, and anxieties, privileges, and differ from the top to the bottom of this hierarchy. So next, I'll quickly run through this social structure on the farm, starting with the executives and moving through to the berry pickers. The 3rd generation of Japanese-American Tanaka brothers makes up the majority of executives on this farm. You can see some of them in the front of this slide during a strike that happened in the 2nd summer that I lived there. The other executives are Anglo-American professionals who've been brought in from other businesses. The executives work seated behind desks in private offices and live in their own houses, some of which have panoramic views of the valley. They work long hours, usually starting before the sun comes up. They often take time off during the day to work out at the local gym or to meet friends for lunch. They worry about farm survival in a bleak landscape of competition and economic globalization, having seen neighbors' farms go bankrupt or sell out to larger corporate farms. The crop managers have private offices in a small field house several miles into the field, though they spend significant amount of time each day walking through the fields and overseeing what's going on. They work similar hours to the executives with somewhat less choice in when they take breaks, roughly dependent on whether their bosses are nearby. That was a joke, but it's also true. They're all Anglo-Americans and they live in private houses in one of the nearby towns. The administrative assistants work seated at desks in common areas and live in relatively simple family houses near the farm. They're almost entirely white, with a few US citizen Latinas who come up from Texas. The teenage checkers, local Anglo high school students, weigh the berries and spend much of their time waiting. Both the administrative assistants and the teenage checkers worry primarily about the moods and reactions of their supervisors. The other workers live in one of the labor camps. The first holds 50 people and is located 100 feet from the road. Each shack here has heating and insulation. The field supervisors who walk through the field observing and directing the pickers live in this camp. Some treat their workers with respect, while others use outright racist epithets. They are bilingual in Spanish and English, almost entirely U.S. citizen Latinos from Texas, along with one Mixtec indigenous man from the Mexican state of Oaxaca. The other labor camp, located several miles away from the farm headquarters, holds 250 people. The shacks here have no heating and no insulation. This is where the majority of the farm's laborers, strawberry pickers who are paid per pound, live. They're made up almost entirely of undocumented Triqui indigenous Mexicans. Marcelina, a 28-year-old Triqui picker, explained, "It's very difficult for a person here. I came to make money. Like I thought here on the other side of the border there's money, but no. Sometimes the checkers steal pounds. Sometimes rotten berries make it into the bucket. Eat that one, they say, throwing it into your face. They don't work well. This is not good. There in Oaxaca, we don't have work. There are no jobs there. Only the men work sometimes. But since there are many children in my family, the men don't make money for me and my son. That's why I wanted to come here to make money, but no." In many ways, ethnicity, education, citizenship, I didn't take the appropriate position in the labor hierarchy. For the purposes of my fieldwork, I positioned myself in the housing and occupations of the Triqui indigenous, undocumented Mexicans. I picked twice gained bodily data such as knee, back, and hip pain. I often felt sick to my stomach the night before picking due to stress about reaching the minimum weight. But because of my social and cultural capital, the farm executives treated me as someone out of place, giving me special permission to keep my job and my labor camp shack, even though I was actually never able to pick the minimum weight. Crop managers and supervisors treated me as a sort of expected entertainment. They often joked with me using rhetorical questions like, "Are you still glad you chose to pick?" And they would pick into my bucket to keep me from falling too far behind. On the other hand, the other pickers interacted with me with a mixture of respect and suspicion. Many wondered why there was a gabacho chacan, a bald-headed white American, picking berries. Several people believed that I was a spy for the police or the border patrol or the federal government, and others thought that I was a drug smuggler who was hiding out from the police or the border patrol or the federal government. During dinner one evening in his labor camp shack, Samuel, who's standing up with the Nets hat on, complained to me about the problems that lack of resources cause in his home village. And he said that they need a strong mayor to fix things. I asked him if he would be mayor someday. And clearly understanding social hierarchy, he replied, "No, you have to have education and money and ideas. You'll be mayor of San Miguel, Seth, and you can do a lot of good. We need a water pump and paved roads." Near the end of my research, Samuel told me, "Right now, we and you are the same, we're poor, but later you'll be rich and live in a luxury house, a casa de lujo." I explained that I didn't want a luxury house, but rather a simple house. I was thinking of a little craftsman in South Berkeley, where I did grad school, or in Seattle, where I went to undergrad. And Samuel clarified, "But you'll have a bathroom on the inside, right?" This ethnicity and citizenship hierarchy not only produces the labor and housing pecking order that I described, but this whole complex maps onto the health and suffering inequalities that were outlined at the beginning of the talk. Triqui people inhabit the bottom rung of the hierarchy in the Skagit with the most stressful and physically strenuous jobs, with the most exposure to weather and pesticides. They live in the coldest, wettest shacks in the most hidden labor camp. In her recent essay on obesity, literary scholar Lauren Berlant develops a theory of slow death. Exploring temporality, suffering, and agency within contemporary forms of capitalism, she defines slow death as, quote, "the physical wearing out of a population or deterioration of people that is very nearly a defining condition of their experience and historical existence." She describes slow death as the embodiment towards death as a way of life. Berlant describes the ordinary and taken for granted attrition of life, agency, and the subject herself in the context of neoliberal capitalist exploitation. She argues that slow death is, quote, "not memorable," and not capable of causing meaningful change because it is experienced as crisis ordinariness, as a defining characteristics of normal life for particular classes of people. Indigenous Mexican farm workers experience an everyday, ongoing life akin to the slow death described by Berlant. Migrant farm workers suffer myriad health problems due to the conditions in which they live and work, including chronic pesticide and heat exposure, repeated carrying of heavy loads, regular work with dangerous machinery, and protracted harvesting while bent over or kneeling. It would be equally fair, however, to mention that the chronic conditions causing migrant farm worker injury include the neoliberal weak state and strong market. For example, the North American Free Trade Agreement, disallowing poor countries from protecting their citizens with tariffs, while allowing relatively wealthy countries to protect their products with inverse tariffs known as subsidies, as well as racism and anti-immigrant prejudice effectively barring certain classes of people from specific jobs and funneling undocumented Mexican immigrants into some of the most dangerous and unhealthy positions in society. Farm work is defined by the temporality and spatiality of slow death. Strawberry pickers on the farm in Washington state are required to bring in a minimum of 50 pounds of de-leafed, ripe strawberries every hour. Otherwise, they're fired and kicked out of camp. In order to meet this requirement, they take few or no breaks from the sunrise until the afternoon when that field is completed. This is actually a picture that I took maybe a half hour into picking or an hour into picking just as the sun was starting to rise. Many don't eat or drink anything before work, so they don't have to take time to use a porta potty. They work as hard and fast as they can, picking bent over at the waist, 7 days a week, rain or shine, without a day off until the last strawberry is processed. They leave their families and homelands to hike through a dangerous desert in order to survive. Yet these times and spaces of slow death are largely invisible, as politicians ignore immigrant workers in the midst of ongoing debates on both sides of health reform. Because of the contemporary racialized, classed, and illegalized definitions of the categories Mexican, migrant, and farm worker, the chronic wearing out due to these labor and living conditions is deemed normal for, even natural to, those persons positioned in these social categories. For Mexican migrant farm workers, death is happening, meted out over time and space. After my first week on the farm, one young female picker told me that she could no longer feel anything in her body at all. Another said that her knees, back, and hips are, quote, always hurting. One of the young men I saw playing basketball before the harvest started told me that he and his friends could no longer play because their bodies hurt too much. Abelino, a tricky father of 4 who lived near me in the labor camp, explained, "You pick with both hands at once, bent over, kneeling like all the way down. Your back hurts, you get knee pains and pain here," and he touched his hip. "When it rains, you get pretty mad, but you have to keep picking. They don't give lunch breaks. You have to work every day like that to make anything. You suffer a lot in work." During my field research, several of my family and friends visited me in the different sites, and many of them automatically blamed the farm executives solely for the living and working conditions of berry pickers. They assumed that it was completely the growers' fault that the pickers live in such poor conditions and that they could easily rectify the situation. This is an aerial view of the Skagit Valley from 1936 to 1996, and we can see hints of 2 processes going on throughout the United States and throughout much of the world. First, you can see urbanization. The 2 cities of Mount Vernon and Burlington are growing. During my field work, both Costco and Walmart bought farm land that had been farms prior to that. And then you can see hints that smaller family farms are being consolidated into larger and larger corporate farms. The hierarchy on the farm is not entirely conscious or chosen on the part of the farm owners. Much the opposite, the inequalities are driven also by structural violence as well as the anxieties it produces. The stark market competition and precarious future of the farm squeezes growers such that they have a hard time conceiving of increasing the pay of pickers or improving the labor camps without being worried about bankrupting the farm. At the same time, of course, we have to be wary of that logic when we're fighting for organizing and unions. The structural nature of the labor hierarchy comes into further relief when the hopes and values of the growers are considered. The Tanaka farm executives are ethical people who have a vision of a good society that includes family farming. They expressed many times they wanted to treat their workers well, and they wanted to leave a legacy for their children. Several of them asked my opinions about what they could do to improve the situation on the farm, and many of them went and asked farm workers throughout the labor camps what they should do. So perhaps instead of blaming only growers, it's also appropriate to understand them as human beings trying to lead ethical yet comfortable lives in the midst of an unequal and harsh system. So now that we've considered the ethnicity-citizenship hierarchy and the ways in which it produces health, I'd like to move on to talk about the practice of migrant health. First, I'll consider the migrant clinic in general before moving on to the illness and treatment experiences of two tricky migrant laborers. Medical professionals in the field of migrant health work under difficult circumstances with unreliable sources of funding. One year they might have a governor who installs a diabetes educator grant, and then a few years later the new governor will cut that grant and recommend a grant for bilingual children's books. We'll have to figure out, okay, how do we get that grant? What do we do with diabetic patients, etc. They often feel hopeless as they watch the health of their migrant patients systematically decline. Dr. Samuelson, a physician in the migrant clinic in the Skagit Valley, explained, "I see an awful lot of people just wearing out, 40-something or early 30s. They're just worn out. They have been used and abused and worked physically harder than anybody should be expected to work for that number of years. Then they come out with this nagging back pain. You work it up and it's not getting better, and you don't think there's any malingering going on. It gets to the point where you have to give them an MRI scan and their back is toast. In their early 40s, they have the arthritis of a 70-year-old and they're not getting better. They're told, sorry, go back to what you're doing, and they're stuck. They're screwed, in a word, and it's tragic." At the same time that most health professionals in the field feel overworked and relatively powerless to change these large structural forces causing health problems for their patients, they also voice a commitment to work with this population. Many explained feeling that Mexican migrant farm workers deserved high-quality health care, and most described feeling a sense of calling to work with this population. Abelino, a tricky father of 4 who lived near me in the labor camp, experienced acute pain in his right knee one morning when he was pivoting from one row of strawberries to another. After continuing his work in hopes that the pain would go away, he told his supervisor about the incident, and the supervisor said, "Okay," and drove away. Not sure what to do, Abelino kept picking in great pain. 2 days later, work was abruptly canceled, and Abelino and I went into an urgent care clinic. Abelino ended up seeing 4 doctors and a physical therapist, usually without a translator in Spanish, and never with a translator in Triqui. In the intervening months, he limped through camp, taking care of his kids while his wife picked in the field. The urgent care doctor explained that Abelino should not work, he should rest and let his knee recover. The occupational health doctor told Abelino that he could work provided he didn't bend, walk, or stand. Abelino went to the farm office to ask for lighter work of this sort, and the bilingual receptionist told him in a frustrated tone, "No porque no," and didn't offer to let him speak with anyone else. After a few weeks, the occupational health doctor passed Abelino's care to a busy rehabilitation medicine specialist, who told Abelino and me that he must work hard picking strawberries in order to make his knee better. She asked me to translate that he'd been picking incorrectly and hurt his knee because he didn't know how to bend over correctly. But notably, in her rush, she hadn't asked Abelino any details about his work, including how he bent over. And years later, as recently as New Year's, Abelino still tells me that he has knee pain and that, quote, "Los médicos no saben nada." Doctors don't know anything. Crescencio, another tricky man living near my labor camp shack, approached me after picking one day and asked me if I had any medicines for headaches. He explained that every time a supervisor calls him names on the job, makes fun of him, or reprimands him unfairly, he gets an excruciating headache in the center of his head. He told me that the headache made him prone to anger with his wife and children. me that he did not ever want to become violent and wanted help before that could ever happen. He'd seen a few physicians about it in Mexico and the United States, as well as a traditional Triqui healer, but nothing helped long term. The only thing that made his headache go away was drinking 20 to 24 beers, and then he would wake up without a headache. He had to use this remedy a few times in a given week, and I suggested he go into the local migrant clinic to see that if they could try something new for his problem. A week later, he told me that he had seen one of the doctors in the clinic, but that, quote, she didn't know anything. Later, I interviewed this physician about the interaction. She was trained in one of the top medical schools in the country and chose to run this clinic because she wanted to ameliorate the suffering of marginalized populations. She was smart, idealistic, and hardworking in the midst of this busy, understaffed, and underfunded clinic. After looking at her notes in the medical chart, she explained, well, yes, he thinks that he's the victim and thinks that the alcohol or the headache makes him beat his wife. But really, he's the perpetrator and everyone else is the victim. Until he owns his problem, he can't really change. Nothing really works. None of these migraine medicines or anything. But put people in jail because then they see a show of force. That's the only thing that works because then they have to own the problem as theirs and they start to change. He came to see me once and I told him to come back 2 weeks later after not drinking. But he didn't come back 2 weeks later. Instead, he came back a month later. It looks like he told the doc he saw that time something about when people at work tell him what to do, it makes him mad, and that's what gives him a headache. He needs to learn how to deal with authority. We referred him to therapy. Do you know if he's going to therapy? Despite this physician's idealism and good intentions, her busy, difficult job and her education didn't allow her to see the social context of suffering of her patients. In the book, The Birth of the Clinic, Michel Foucault describes a theory of the clinical gaze. He explains that there was a change in the practice of clinical medicine around the time of the advent of cadaveric dissection, or what we call anatomy. Whereas physicians used to focus on the words of the patient, the symptoms as expressed by the patient, they began to focus instead on the diseased organs, treating the patient more as a series of objects making up a body. In Foucault's description, the primary question changed from, quote, what is wrong, to, quote, where does it hurt? This change was necessary for the birth of positivist medical science and contemporary forms of scientific knowledge. As would be expected within this paradigm, the rehabilitation doctor and the migrant health physician described earlier saw the tricky bodies in their offices, yet were unable to engage the human and social context leading to their suffering. Thus, it was unavoidable that they would utilize a narrow lens that decontextualizes sickness, transporting it from the realm of inequalities, power, and politics to the realm of the individual body. Yet since the time of Foucault, the paradigm of biopsychosocial health has been taken up in schools of medicine, nursing, and public health. Beyond the acontextual gaze theorized by Foucault, physicians in North America today are also taught to see behavioral factors in health, such as exercise, diet, and substance use. Behavioral health education has been added as part of the laudable move to broaden how we understand health and healthcare. However, without being trained to consider the social structures that shape the suffering of their patients, health professionals are equipped to see only biological and behavioral determinants of sickness. Thus, well-meaning clinicians are limited, in a sense, to blaming the sickness on the patient, their biology or their behavior. For example, the assumed incorrect bend while picking or the supposed trouble with authority, without appreciating the hierarchies that position their patients in particular riskscapes in the first place. Ironically, the progressive move to include behavioral health in medical education without the correlate inclusion of social analysis may be exactly that which leads clinicians to individualize risk and responsibility, inadvertently blaming the victims of socially structured suffering. So how has this order of inequalities become unchallenged and unquestioned? How has it come to be understood as normal and natural? Pierre Bourdieu's theory of symbolic violence has been helpful. Bourdieu explains that symbolic violence is the naturalization, including internalization, of social asymmetries. He explains that we perceive the social world through historically accreted schemata of perception, in other words, lenses, that are issued forth from that very social world. These cognitive schema then reflect the social structures to which we've become accustomed. Thus, we misrecognize the social order as natural because that which we're perceiving matches our own cognitive schema through which we're perceiving it. The inequalities comprising the social world are thus made invisible or taken for granted or normal for all involved. When I asked a mestiza Mexican social worker why Triqui people have only berry-picking jobs, she explained, "A los oaxaqueños les gusta trabajar agachados." Oaxacans like to work bent over. Whereas she told me mestizo Mexicans, called simply Mexicanos, get too many pains if they work in the field. Later, I asked apple crop manager why I hadn't seen any Triqui people harvesting apples, the field job that has the highest pay. And he explained, Oaxacans are too short to reach the apples. They're too slow. They have to use ladders a lot more than some of the other guys, and besides, they don't like ladders anyway. He continued that Oaxacans are perfect for picking berries, quote, because they're lower to the ground, unquote, which is the same thing that George Murphy, a senator from California, said in a Senate hearing about migrant labor. These perceptions of bodily difference along ethnic lines serve as the lenses through which symbolic violence is enacted. In this way, each category of body is understood to deserve its relative position in society. Because of what's perceived to be their natural characteristics, indigenous Mexican bodies are understood to belong picking berries as opposed to other jobs. On the other hand, mestizo Mexicans and white Americans are understood to have bodies that don't fit well in the picking berry and belong doing other work. At the same time that symbolic violence involves the normalization of the social and health position of other groups, this theory also involves a subtle sense of internalization. One doesn't perceive only others, but also oneself as belonging in ordained social positions. During my second day picking strawberries, a tractor with long metal extensions spraying something in the air drove through the field while we picked. I asked a supervisor what it was. "Do you really want to know? You sure you want the truth?" I answered yes. "Dangerous insecticides," he said, shaking his head at me. The supervisor went on to explain that the white patches on the strawberry leaves are largely due to pesticide residue. I later noticed danger signs posted in English on several large canisters surrounding one of the hand washing and outhouse stations in the field. Interestingly, I hadn't noticed that for months, but after I started thinking about this, I took a picture. Strawberry pickers worked every day without gloves as the visible pesticide residue dissolved in the mixture of strawberry juice that stained our hands dark maroon for the rest of the day. If they ate anything, they ate it in the field while picking, often without washing their hands in order to save time and make the minimum weight. The same week as the spraying that I just described, I received a video I'd ordered from the United Farm Workers about the health effects of pesticides. Several Triqui pickers watched it with me, and afterwards, like after any movie, I asked them what did they think. One of them told me matter-of-factly, "Pesticides affect only white Americans, gabachos, because your bodies are delicate and weak." And being the one who couldn't keep up picking, I proved that. Another confirmed, "We Triqui are strong and hold out." Aguantamos is the verb, and the others nodded. In this way, Triqui people show a sense of ethnic pride. It's probably necessary in the midst of a painful history of discrimination and land dispossession, both in Mexico and the United States. At the same time, this sense of pride appears simultaneously to lend itself to the justification of their position in the labor hierarchy. In effect, Triqui conceptions of honor at having stronger, tougher bodies may aid in making the destructive impact of their social position less visible. In essence, the indigenous Mexican migrant body is made to betray itself. Specifically because of perceptions of ethnic body difference, the migrant body is seen as belonging in its position in the very agricultural labor hierarchy that then leads to its deterioration. These mechanisms of rendering inequality invisible are potentiated by internalization into Triqui forms of pride. The structural violence inherent to segregated labor on the farm is so effectively erased precisely because its disappearance takes place at the level of the body and is thus understood to be natural. So in conclusion, attention to what's hidden in U.S. agriculture reveals a segregation of laboring bodies by perceived ethnicity and citizenship into a hierarchy that in turn produces correlated suffering. Such inequalities are effectively naturalized through the symbolic violence enacted by perceived bodily differences along ethnic lines. In addition, migrant health professionals tend not to see the labor hierarchy nor its production of sickness through their clinical gaze. Instead, they often subtly blame patients for their suffering and recommend interventions inadvertently complicit with the social hierarchy. The structural nature of these inequalities is illuminated by the fact that even idealistic and ethical clinicians and farmers operate within a gray zone that neutralizes and sometimes even reverses their efforts at moral and ethical action. So if anthropologists and community and environmental sociologists and pediatricians and seasonal and migrant labor inspectors are to work together toward positive social change, we must denaturalize social inequalities, uncovering linkages between structural violence, symbolic violence, and slow death. In this way, these schemata of perception, as well as the social structures they reinforce, can be transformed. In addition, this intellectual project of denaturalizing social and health inequalities might inform pragmatic, activist, and policy efforts at many levels of a micro to macro continuum, from including pickers in farm English classes to including the social determinants of health, or what some of us MD PhDs in the social sciences are calling structural competency in medical education, from of farms that treat workers fairly to the lobbying of politicians to change unrealistic and violent immigration policies, and finally to activist and policy work for a more equitable global market, such that people may be free to, but are not forced to leave their homes to migrate in the first place. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for Q&A. We were sadly unable to get ourselves a handheld mic that lets you feel strong about being the person to ask questions. But it turns out it doesn't actually amplify your voice. Last year we learned this, so we're actually just as well without it, because this way you won't be tempted to speak softly. So if you raise your hand, I'm just going to point at you rather than walking around with the mic, which also means less work for me.
There were two people from the capstone course who didn't get to ask their question earlier. Do you remember if any of you were those people? Yes.
Mike?
So in your book, you mentioned the socially structured separation between lead consumers and pickers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just wondering, what do you see as the most important steps in reducing that separation? And I believe in the capstone you mentioned the labels, the EFI.
EFI.
Are there other steps?
Yeah. Yes, good question. So the question was, in the book I write about the structural social separation between the eaters and the harvesters of food, and how can that separation be broken down. So if I'm tempted to write on the whiteboard, but I might not. So my summary of Bourdieu, I think a lot with Bourdieu. I think he's really helpful, and Foucault. But Bourdieu writes a lot about the ways that the structures of society and the symbols, the lenses through which we perceive them, can either reproduce each other or challenge and change each other. So examples of that I think with in this aspect are migrant farm workers are bent over in the soil all day long. They're also often referred to in the newspaper as dirty. When a migrant labor camp is, or an apartment building that has a lot of migrant laborers is moved, people talk about cleaning up the neighborhood as kind of what happened. When the white patients in the migrant clinic complained about the farm workers, they talked about dirty Mexicans. So there's the structure, this hierarchy that makes this category of person work in a certain way and then there's this symbol of dirtiness that reinforces it. And we could talk about Mary Douglas and other ways of thinking about dirt that also apply here, but I'm not going to go into that. So on some level, one way to change that can either be seen as a reproduction of society's kind of inequalities, which is often how Bourdieu is read, but I think it's also a way that we can think about change. So if the farm shifts who's working in what ways, like one of the United Farm Workers farms where people are rotated and sometimes work in the dirt and sometimes are using hose or driving tractors, then everyone's, all of these people are a little bit dirty some of the times and not everyone. And that might shift how the symbol works. That then shifts how people think about needing to clean up the neighborhood or not. An example of, so symbol and structure are the two things that are kind of that are reinforcing each other either in their reproduction of inequality or their change. One example of change that I can think of is the Washington Post and the New York Times signed on to an agreement not to use the word illegal anymore or illegal alien about undocumented immigrants because the word illegal sounds scary to us. It sounds criminal, and criminal sounds violent. And so there's this easy shift from someone doesn't have the right papers to I should be really scared, I should be scared of them. And that influences the way ways people vote. It influences the kind of annual tally of how many kids in Southern California shoot Mexican-looking people with BB guns. All kinds of things that go into this institutionalized form of racial hierarchy. So if we get rid of if we're not using the word illegal, we lose some of that fear. We also know aliens are scary because they're green and they're from Mars. So if we talk then about undocumented immigrants or unauthorized immigrants or labor immigrants or farm migrants, that says a different thing. It still has, different valences that might not be helpful, as I mentioned in the talk, but it's different. And then that can shift the structure of how immigration policy gets voted in or all of these things. So I think on some level we can work on the structure side, things from farms that are treating their workers well, Equitable Food Initiative, United Farm Workers Contract farms, the PCUN, Piñeros y Campesinos Unidos. There's a group called Familias Unidas por la Justicia. There are lots of coalition of Immokalee workers, the film Food Chain, which somebody talked with me about today, which is wonderful. Support those kind of structural moves and support these kinds of symbol moves, and I think they both are important. Yes?
How did you see the opportunities for the children living with these families? Was it, did they have the option for education, or were they kind of hush-hush, pushed in the background?
That's a good question. Some of the graduate students and I talked about that at lunch. So most of the kids during this period were being moved. In Washington State, there's a state-funded migrant daycare program and a migrant Head Start, like preschool. In California, where we were, there weren't any of those. So in Washington State, the daycare vans would come and pick up the kids in the morning, and then at the end of the day, one of the workers would call them and say we were back in the camp, and they would bring them back. In California, either the kids would come with us into the field and just sort of play near us. I have pictures, I think in the book, of one of the kids kind of playing with the pruning shears while his dad is using a different kind of pruning shears. Most of them were going to school when they were of the right age, but had a hard time with it because they would start in Washington. They would be maybe during blueberry season, they'd be in Washington State through October, and then all of a sudden they would move to California and try to enter the same grade, but maybe they were doing a different kind of math or a different whatever. So that a lot of them had a rough time in school. There's also a difference between which I'm starting to think about doing new project on. The kids who were born at the beginning of my research are now, 12 years old, because the beginning of my research was '03. And those kids are the first US citizens in this kind of extended network of treatment. And so far, it looks to me like there's a kind of explicit understanding that everyone in the family documented will work to support putting the US citizen kids through school. And most families are no longer working on this farm. Most of them have either somewhat stably settled in the Skagit Valley or Central California and are doing, working in a potato processing plant in Washington State, or one of the people, Samuel actually, who was standing up with the Nets hat on, he has been promoted to be the one who drives the truck that sucks the sewage out of the porta potties on the farms in California. So most of them are a little more stable, and their kids have more possibility of going through school. And I'm now getting pretty interested in who are those kids going to be, and who will they be identified as by others, by white people, by Latinos, by mestizo Mexicans, by indigenous Mexicans, and who will they, on some level, kind of identify as? What kind of subjectivity will they develop, and how does that relate to all kinds of things? Like, will they get involved with kind of certain kinds of Chicano gangs, or will they hang out with their native Mexican families, or who will they be? I don't know. So I might write about that someday. Yes, there are 4 questions. So you had your hand up a while ago, and then 3, 4. Do you still want to ask a question?
Sure. So in the conclusion of your book, and a bit in this talk, you talk about changes kind of from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering about any ideas towards changes from the top down, as that kind of seems to me as presented in classes of how neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm. How do you mean? Help me.
Like, it's often pointed to like the 1980s Reagan era where neoliberalism was born.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering, is there a sort of revolution
Mm-hmm.
to counter neoliberalism?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
I like it. I don't know if it makes sense to me yet, but I talked about some examples of change that could happen from the bottom up, and what about change that could happen from the top down? I mean, it depends on where the top is on some level. Like, you could argue that me pushing for not just cultural competency, which tells doctors and public health workers and social workers not to be ethnocentric jerks, but also structural competency, which keeps an awareness of inequality, power differentials, and kind of political things that make people sick, that's from the top down because I'm an MD, PhD, and I'm pushing for it. Or you could argue that it's grassroots because I'm only 39, I don't know. And you also asked about kind of moves to counter neoliberalism. I can't think of can you think of a top-down example of moves to counter? I mean, I can think of Warren Buffett is certainly a thing. He has a lot of money, and he's taken on social inequalities and like the extreme of neoliberal capitalism that pushes for kind of no social safety net and no public education, and it's fine for people to be really rich while other people can barely survive or can't survive. And he's taking that on and saying that's not fair. Those of us who have way too much money we don't need it all. But the sad thing for me is that then he's been lambasted in the media by some people for engaging in class warfare, as though this super wealthy guy is attacking wealthy people. But on some level, some wealthy people think he is, because he's saying that it's okay to tax him and his peers. So can you think of examples that you're thinking of? Okay. We can reception. So then you had a question, I think?
Yeah, we had a visiting scholar here on campus about a year ago who focused focused on a topic that I think many people don't, which is psychological stress of undocumented peoples in the U.S. when they are forced, for whatever reason, to return to their home country, as opposed to the stress associated with trying to get here. And I'm just curious whether that ever came up in your conversations with your study population.
Good question. Esther brought that up during lunch too. So far, one of the people I became close to basically can't come to the U.S. anymore because he's been apprehended so many times by the Border Patrol that he's been told that if he gets apprehended again, he'll be in jail for a long time. So he is back in his home village, and actually recently the telephone company cut off service to the Triqui zone of Oaxaca. So they have to go to a city in order to call their families now, which is a big shift. It used to be that there was regular conversation, and now there's not anymore. So I actually haven't heard from him probably in several months. There's not a lot of about worries about going back and how stressful it will be, partially because I think for this group of people, most people come to the U.S. still with a certain goal in mind. I want to save this much money to build my house, and then I want to be back in my home area. Some people have overstayed those goals because crossing the border is so hard that they're worried that if they go back, they can't come back to make money again. But it's a different story. I think the kids who were born here or who moved here really young, they're just becoming kind of tweens, and I don't know what it'll be like for them. They're the ones I'm getting more interested in, both, especially the U.S. citizens, but also the non-citizens who've lived here basically their whole lives. What will they think about home? Where's home? And what would it be like to go back to San Miguel? I don't know. And then I think there's a question here. Yeah.
I was going to ask, kind of related to that, given the realities in the U.S. fields, do people in general still want to come here? Because does it make sense to you? I guess you were in Oaxaca also.
Yeah. There are still a lot of people who come here from southern Mexico, from Oaxaca, from Chiapas, Guerrero, the poorest states in Mexico, that had been mostly subsistence farming and like selling a little bit of their farmware, farm goods. It's still really hard to survive there. I think there was a recent study the University of Arizona did on border crossings over the last 20 years since NAFTA was signed, showing that just people keep coming, like the number of Triqui people needing to leave, feeling like they were forced to leave their home, took a huge jump after the North American Free Trade Agreement. More and more people have been dying in the desert, slowly increasing number over the last 20 years. So people are still coming despite the conditions here, largely because the conditions there in a certain way don't feel survivable. At one point in my book, I take on the binary of refugee and immigrant, because refugee has this definition of politically forced, and immigrant has this definition of voluntarily, economically chosen. And I try to point out the ways that the immigrants experience being forced by the politics that push the economics, that make them leave their home farms to then work as laborers on our farms. So I try to question that binary of politics and choice. But there are a lot of people who still feel forced to come here. There are a couple of people, I think Abimelech wrote a book called The Suffering of the Immigrant, where he writes about North African immigrants to France and how the immigrants in France talk about France in a way that is caring towards their family members back in North Africa, telling things about how everything's fine and we're doing well and don't worry about us as a form of care. But then that form of care also produces an image of France that's not France. It's a different thing. And when people then arrive to France, the place, they realize that France, the narrative that was caring for them, is not very related to France, the place. And I think there's some of that going on too, where people, a lot of Mexican migrants in the US talk with their family members in ways to care for their family members that then isn't always the whole story about what they're experiencing. And then there was one other, yeah.
I haven't read your book, so I'm sorry if you cover this in the book, but you talk about people to clinics who were giving birth, and I was wondering if you could just describe like what it's like for people to be pregnant or what it's like to have a newborn.
Yeah. There were a few different births that I attended. One woman went into labor while picking and then went to the hospital straight from the field, gave birth to, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, gave birth to a baby who was premature. And then as the pediatrician was releasing the baby from the kind of incubator to go home with the family, he explained to the family that they needed to keep the baby's nursery between 65 and 75 degrees at all times. And the tricky people, nodded and were nice and thankful to him. And then afterwards I said, actually there's no baby nursery and there's no insulation and there's no thermostat. So if that's really important, then we need to think about a different way to think about it. And he ended up coming to the labor camp and visiting them and kind of seeing where they lived and thinking about alternative ways to help care for them, which was kind of great. Another woman had a complicated pregnancy, was taken to Seattle, and gave birth in Seattle. And in that hospital, they didn't have readily available Spanish translation, much less Triqui or Mixtec. And in the chart, it said that she refused a breast pump. And I remember talking with the social worker, and the social worker said, well, we don't have translation, especially at night. They have those blue phones that lots of people don't use because they're kind of a pain. But the social worker said, I can just imagine somebody, a nurse going in there with this electrical machine and like aiming it at her breasts and talking with her in English about it, and the woman saying no, and then that becomes she refused, breast pump. So there's a lot of difficulty with our healthcare system. Even those of us who are doctors, I have a hard time with our healthcare system, Interacting with doctors in our medical system is not easy, and I sort of know how to frame my sicknesses for them to be like easily digestible. So then if you don't have that training, and then you're, of a category of person who's understood for it to be sort of normal for you to have these kinds of aches and pains and problems, and then you have language differences, and then the physician assumes that you have a upper middle class house like they do, then there's a lot of cultural competency and structural competency that's needed. Good question. Walt.
I was struck by the they don't know anything. And if you will, the inverse hierarchization of medical knowledge. I wonder if you could reflect on that if you're dealing with Foucault's medical days in a way they're turning it on its head.
Yeah.
Equally, though, I'm wondering about a treatment conceptualization of disability. Because disability is throughout the book and throughout the talk, whether it be creeds or chronic pain or early arthritis. And so what is a more indigenous perception of what is disability if it exists at all?
Yeah.
And then how does it interface with, if you were healing workers, Thomas?
Yeah. Great question. So yeah, you're right. On some level, they're they're critiquing the kind of decontextualization of a positivist medical knowledge, and they're saying that, they don't know anything. That's not knowledge. If it doesn't have historical, social context, then it doesn't, they don't know anything. It's not knowledge. And that's an interesting way to think about it. In terms of disability, the things that I think about with disability and the tricky people I knew relate to space and place, I think. That largely, if someone is disabled, if someone's not able to work, they go back to Mexico. If they're able to work, they're here. And that's part of the definition of the functional definition of what disability is. If you become disabled, if your back becomes so bad you can't work, if you're injured in a way that you can't work, if you're shot by a gun and you can't work anymore, you go back and you're part of the kind of subsistence, collective, care for each other kind of economy of the home village. And if you can work, then you're here and you're saving money and sending money back. But I'd love to talk with you more about that as an expert in disability studies. Yeah.
We have time for a couple more questions, and then we should invite people to get outside.
How about we, all four of you, say your question, and I'll pretend it's one question and try to answer it. Do you want to say yours?
So your comment about refugees sort of reminded me about sort of thinking about the impacts of climate change on agriculture. And if that was something that came up in your discussion, I can totally see how that could be, both not only a pressure on farm executives in terms of thinking about land use and dwindling yields, but also considering migrant workers are working on sort of a yield-based income, how sort of agricultural resilience in the face of changing climate could be a threat to their income directly.
Yep, great question. Next question.
I'm here as a clinician, and actually, wanted to just point out for those who haven't been to the Skagit Valley, it's one of the most beautiful places on the planet, which makes it all the more poignantly kind of horrific. I actually used to take care of patients down in South Tacoma, so this is very close to home for me, including some very dear Truckee patients. So I thank you for reminding me of them. My question since being here in Madison is, we are surrounded here by some of the worst disparities in social determinants and health outcomes in this very city, compared, to the entire nation. And I'm trying to figure out how you keep these issues on the table. It takes a tragedy, it seems sometimes, to get people to pay attention, right? So Tony Robinson had to die, and finally people start paying attention to this data that's been out there since 2013, right, the Race to Equity report. And so what I was intrigued by is this idea, so I'm both enamored by issues of data in population health, I'm also in love with issues of narrative medicine, and how to sort of keep these issues on the stage. Do you balance the two of that? You told stories today, which I thought was a very beautiful thing, and actually decided not to use a lot of data, but I just would be intrigued on that level, like how do you blend that together to try to keep the momentum going, if at all?
Great question. You had a question.
I was thinking.
Okay. And behind you.
Yeah, coming from the Central Valley, having lived in a migrant labor camp and having parents that are still ill camps, there's, and me being part of this larger family unit that work, to sustain, to live in poverty, basically. But I'm trying to imagine this idea that you talked about at the end of your talk, the right to stay home. And what does the right to stay home say to what it is you're writing about, and how does it disentangle a lot of this hierarchies? What would it mean to have the right to stay home, to not be illegal?
And then you had a question.
Yeah, so in your narrative about the kind of performance, you talk about Chicano and Chicana U.S. citizens from Texas who come and work on the farm. So I guess I'm wondering more about their narrative and how they're motivations and migration patterns align or differ from those of people indigenous to Mexico who are not citizens.
Okay. I'm going to take 1, 3, 4 first and then end with 2 because I have more to talk about on that one. So climate change wasn't something that came up explicitly much. People didn't talk about, oh, this, these areas have been, desertifying or changing in this way, and that's part of why we need to leave. Although certain kinds of data would argue that that's played into it. And the farm owners didn't talk much about climate change shifting things. They talked a lot more about policies and whether immigration policies and labor policies. And these farm owners actually supported fair, comprehensive immigration reform in a sort of surprising way because they wanted workers to be able to feel like they could be more stably here, which would help them. So it's a part of it, but it wasn't explicitly discussed that much. In terms of the Texans, so the people I knew from Texas mostly were bilingual people. Some of them were Spanish-only speaking U.S. citizens, but most of them were bilingual. And the younger ones, like there was the kind of known to be most racist supervisor was mostly Spanish-speaking mom who called the Triqui people all kinds of names, burro, perro, donkey dog, things like that. Her daughter was kind of known to be one of the nicest, fairest supervisors. And her daughter came and worked June through October and then went to community college spring semester each year. And she wanted to become a history teacher. So she was working on the farm in Washington State in order to kind of be able to put herself through school the other half of the year and go to school half time. So a lot of the younger ones did not have very much financial means, but were using this as a way to plan for a future where they could get ahead more. So that's that answer. In terms of the right to stay home, how would it look? I want to talk with you more about that because on some level, I think if the Triqui people had the right to stay home or had the ability to stay home, if NAFTA were not NAFTA, if it were something else, then it wouldn't look like this at all because I don't think they would be here. I think they would be in San Miguel, doing their own farming foodies in Madison and Berkeley picture the kind of farm that we want to support. We tend to, I'm going to speak for me and some of the interviews I've done. We tend to picture white farmers, but we picture these kind of family farms that are organic and sustainable. In fact, the Triqui people have exactly those farms. They and their family live near the farm. They know the animals. They talk with the animals. They do the hoeing and they do the harvesting and they go outside and there's a breeze and they might sing songs and they bring each other food and it's kind of exactly the idyllic thing we picture, but they're not the category of person we tend to picture. And their category of person being Mexican, et cetera, because of NAFTA and other things that the US largely has pushed, they can't stay on their idyllic family farm and then end up with this kind of farming that's a lot more painful. So that's my answer to that, but I'd love to talk about it more. And then the last question, first I will challenge and then I will support. So stories are data. Narrative, ethnography, when I give quotes, that's data. That's real, those are real quotes, those are real people I'm telling about. Data are not just p-values, data are not just statistics. And there's a hierarchy in health sciences of p-values. There's a hope in p-values and statistics that's what will change things. But there's been some research that has shown that policymakers actually think with and listen to and are moved by narrative data in a way so politicians tend to be moved by narrative data. Policymakers who are writing the actual policies tend to be moved more by p-values and statistics. So they're both important, and if they're done well, they're both data. So that's the challenge to you on that, because I think that in some ways devalues the qualitative. But how do we do this in a long-term way? You're right that there's so many pressures to undo a move to bring awareness of social determinants and social inequalities and political histories and institutional racism histories. There's so many forces that want to undo that within medicine and public health and healthcare, that we do have to be vigilant about it. I think that's right. I'm a part of a group at sort of roughly at UC Berkeley that's called the Radical Experiments in Medicine Collective, and it's MDs from various hospitals, street medics who kind of are protest medics, some sociologists and anthropologists who are working together to kind of think through and practice how healthcare might be different. And one of the things that we're doing is trying to create a structural competency training for the family medicine residency in Santa Rosa, California, that's affiliated with UCSF. And the way that we're currently planning it is there are two places that have already added structural competency to their medical curriculum. One is Penn and one is Oregon Health Science University. So we're trying to do this with this residency in a way that first there would be teaching about social determinants, because we actually don't get that much in medical school. I would argue we don't even get nearly enough in public health school. Public health school is way too individualistic and behavior, all the data that we have about it, both narrative and statistical. So what we're planning is just some teaching about how important social inequalities are for health, because they're basically the main factor that determines who's sick. Even geneticists argue that the genetics explains a minority, but then that's where most of our money goes. And then the second section of each would be a brainstorming through cases that the residents have seen of patients about what are practical things that they could do differently to be structurally competent? How could they respond differently to their patients in the clinic? How could they advocate on a broader political level for things that would help people not be made sick in the first place? And then the third section, or the third hour, we have planned to be a brainstorming of impractical things they could do, which probably isn't the right way to say it, but I don't want them to be constrained to, oh, that's not realistic, because maybe one of them will come up with some really cool Gesundheit clinic or whatever, what's his name, Patch Adams or something that's really different, and then later I can bring him back to Berkeley to, talk in my classes about it, and it'll be really inspiring. So that's our idea, teaching about the importance, practical kind of change that they can imagine, and then sort of impractical or unlimited, imaginings. So I'm very aware, so cultural competence came from largely, I don't know if this is true, this is the story that we tell, that anthropologists were critiquing medicine for being ethnocentric, and the response to that critique was cultural competence. And it started out being sort of a list of traits, and I have some of the early cultural competence books that are now a little bit scary, like Puerto Ricans talk loud because they come from large families, Black people eat fried foods because blah, blah, blah. And you memorize these things and then you're culturally competent. The more recent version, which isn't actually that recent anymore, is cultural humility, which is much more ask questions of your patients to learn who they are. Don't assume you know based on who you are or based on what they look like. And that's super important because we don't want to be assuming that everyone's like us or that everyone's like each other. At the same time, a lot of cultural competency leaves out this political aspect, these inequalities, these social determinants. And so I think it's really important for us to have something like structural competence at the same time that I'm aware that it might do something like cultural competence did for a while and go off base and lose its politics. But now is a moment where we can imagine what it might be, and maybe some people at Wisconsin can imagine the Wisconsin version of how to do structural competence in the School of Medicine and Nursing and of these things more. That's my answer. Thanks.
One more round of applause for Seth, please. And really, please do come out and join us for food and drinks just outside this room in the atrium. Thanks for coming. See you next year.